The first thing you need to understand is that I'm not a superstitious man. Whatever gods there may be, I've never been too concerned with pleasing them. Never really seemed to make a difference for those who were. Oh, I proclaim Emperor Tiberius as God, but that's a practical matter. It's a necessary fiction for preserving the power and majesty of the Roman Empire. But I'm no fool. I know he's only a man. See, I'm practical. I don't believe in gods. I don't trust in priests or magic. I trust in iron blades, disciplined formations, and being owed favors by the right kinds of people. It's not to say that I don't appreciate the power of fanaticism. No, I realize how powerful the belief in the supernatural can be. These Jews have taught me that. They cling to this superiority complex no matter how many times they're ground under the foot of a superior army or overthrown by a more organized civilization. These Jews continue to believe that they are the chosen people, that their God is the only one that matters, and that it's just a matter of time before every other people group on earth is wiped out. Starting with us Romans, of course. It's a dangerous idea. It's a powerful fantasy. I've lost men to that delusion. If only they could give up this idea that some Messiah is going to come and rescue them, things would be so much easier for them. But make no mistake, it is the terrorists fighting on behalf of some god or his divine appointee that are the true danger. The ones that claim the title of Messiah are always dealt with easily enough. I've seen a dozen of them come and go. They're all either madmen or opportunists, and they all end up the same, nailed to a cross. But no matter how many of these messiahs we put to death, those superstitious zealots are always ready to prop up somebody else to rally around. So when I heard about this charismatic, unschooled teacher drawing large crowds up north in Galilee and talking about bringing God's kingdom to earth, I knew where it was headed. And of course, there were stories of miracles, but that was nothing new. Half these charlatans claim to drive out demons or that they can call fire down from heaven. This Jesus must have been pretty convincing, though. I have to admit, the stories that were told about him were far more consistent and compelling than what you usually hear about these so-called saviors. A few of my men were even worried that maybe he really was some kind of a magician. When we heard that he and his followers were coming to Judea, we knew things would be coming to a head soon enough. As far as I knew, he'd made no attempts to raise an army or inspire a rebellion, but the rumors were persistent enough. So many people thought he was the one. It almost didn't matter what he said. He was a symbol. He was a rallying point, and he would have to be dealt with. I wasn't really concerned until I started hearing the stories about this Lazarus of Bethany who supposedly died and was raised back to life by this Jesus. Lazarus was a real man, an important leader in the village of Bethany, and apparently he was vouching for this story, saying that he was dead and in the grave and that this Jesus had brought him back to life. And the rumors were spreading like wildfire, and that concerned me. Not because I thought there was anything to it, but because I was afraid other people might believe it. It's one thing to face down an angry mob who believes that God is on their side. Start killing a few of them, and they quickly reassess that assumption. But imagine a rebellious mob that believes that their God is not only going to guarantee them victory, but can raise them from the dead after they've been struck down. I'm not interested in that kind of crowd control. So when I heard that Jesus and his followers were coming to Jerusalem for Passover, I was a little worried. Passover is a volatile time. You get all these Jews crammed in together, all hyped up on patriotic fervor, telling stories about how their God struck down the mightiest nation on earth to give them freedom. It's not a good time to be a Roman soldier in the city. The last thing we needed was some charismatic rabble-rouser filling their heads with delusions of grandeur. So I started asking around about this Jesus character, trying to see what kind of support he would truly have if he decided to make his move during Passover. And I was pleasantly surprised to learn that although this Jesus of Nazareth must have been a charismatic and compelling speaker, an incredibly convincing con man, he was a terrible politician. He did not have support from any of the influential people in Jerusalem. None of the Jewish religious or political leaders liked him at all. He'd alienated everybody that mattered. In fact, one of the very few things that the liberal Sadducees and the fundamentalist Pharisees agreed on is that they hated this Jesus. He was still popular enough with the common people that nobody wanted to go on record as having killed him, but everybody who really mattered already wanted him dead. And then he showed up in the city. There was no small amount of fanfare out in the countryside among his hardcore supporters. His followers were elated as he marched through the gates, but immediately he did something that made it clear that he was not going to be a real threat. He marched right into the temple and began screaming at the merchants selling animals for sacrifice, overturning the money changers, chasing them out. Nobody who wants to be king is going to alienate their base like that. As a precaution, a few of the men from my cohort were assigned to keep tabs on him as he roamed about the city in the following days, and they reported back that he didn't do anything unusual or dangerous. He spent most of his time arguing with the Jewish community leaders who were trying to trick him or embarrass him. Apparently, Jesus tended to get the better of those exchanges. But they said he didn't say or do anything seditious. In fact, at one point, he even told his fellow Jews that they should be paying their taxes to the Roman emperor. That wasn't going to win him any popularity contests. After that, my concerns about a popular revolt rallying around this Jesus of Nazareth were pretty much nothing. And that's why I was so surprised a couple of days later to receive orders shortly before sunset. We were to accompany a detachment from the Jewish high priest's personal guard to support him in making an arrest. The criminal in question was Jesus of Nazareth. We Romans weren't supposed to arrest him. He wasn't being accused of breaking any Roman laws, but the Jewish leaders had a bone to pick with him, and they were going to try him themselves. They just wanted some support. It was rather unusual request for Roman soldiers to support in the arrest of someone who hadn't broken any Roman laws, but who was I to question it? Of course, I assumed it was just going to be me and my men accompanying this already sufficient detachment of armed guards, but they sent the entire cohort. As we marched out of the city in the fading light, preparing our torches to be lit once it was truly dark, I wondered if I'd misjudged this Jesus. After all, he must be gathering a large group of dangerous men outside the city for some kind of violent attack. Why else would you send 500 of Rome's finest soldiers to take him in? But if that were the case, shouldn't we be the ones arresting him? Couldn't make sense of it. When we finally arrived on the Mount of Olives, I was confused. There only seemed to be about a dozen men, and they didn't know what was going on. They were sleepy and confused. I was sure they were setting us up for an ambush. I kept peering into the shadows between the olive trees, but nobody came out. Eventually, the guards of the high priest's household took charge and took custody of Jesus. They were trying to act brave, but obviously they were terrified of this man in spite of his complete lack of military resources. They must have bought into the miracle mumbo-jumbo, I figured. They tried to act tough, but as soon as he identified himself, they cowered. It wasn't really much of a struggle. One of the guys with Jesus, who clearly had no experience with a sword, pulled out a blade. I heard later he was a fisherman or something. Waved it around wildly. Got some servant across the side of the head. It was really pathetic. Although it did look like he hurt the guy, but it must have not been that bad because after Jesus told him to put away the sword and went over and touched the servant, the bleeding stopped almost immediately. Our orders were to take Jesus and Jesus only, so we let the rest of the men go, and they disappeared into the shadows between the olive trees rather quickly once he was in custody. We accompanied the high priest's guard and their prisoner back into the city and sent them on their way. And that was that, as far as I was concerned. Our men laughed about what a ridiculous assignment we'd just been sent on. But I was thinking about the fact that I was on crucifixion duty the next day. We have crucifixions quite regularly outside the city. We have a steady supply of criminals who need to be made examples of. We always do it out on the hill outside of town, Skull Hill. I have to admit, I did not recognize that Jesus of Nazareth as he was first coming up the hill. To be fair, I had no reason to expect to see him. The Jewish authorities had no authority to condemn a man to death, and as far as I knew, Jesus hadn't been accused of breaking any Roman laws. It was only later that I would learn about how the high priest and his cronies had cornered our governor Pilate, forcing his hand, insisting that Jesus was an insurrectionist, and that if Pilate would not put him to death, then he would be supporting treason. I'm sure Pilate knew, like the rest of us, that Jesus was no terrorist, but for all his peaceful ways, he stubbornly refused to deny the title of king. So Pilate really had no choice. Crucifixion was the practical thing to do. I understood that. But I was still taken aback when I realized who that wobbly, bloody man stumbling up the hill really was. Now, those condemned to death are expected to carry their own crossbeam to the place of execution. That's the piece of wood that fits and is affixed to the larger pole that is then erected to make the instrument on which they will die. As Jesus came up the hill, he wasn't carrying his crossbeam, and it was pretty obvious why. He could barely walk. See, he'd already received the 40 lashes minus one, the harshest penalty short of death that could be given. Pilate had ordered it in hopes that it would satisfy the Jewish leaders and he would be given cover to spare Jesus' life, but it didn't work. So after being nearly killed by the whip, he was now sentenced to die on a cross. For all the damage the whip had done to his body, his face revealed that my fellow soldiers had worked him over quite well also. Policing a city where everyone wants you dead tends to stoke a man's temper. And soldiers who don't get regular battle sometimes need to release their violent tendencies. Prisoners are good for that. Jesus made his way up the hill. I've witnessed a lot of crucifixions in my time. We get a lot of them here in Jerusalem. And I've seen every conceivable reaction. I've seen prisoners pleading with me to spare their lives, offering me wealth that they clearly don't have just to let them go. I've seen prisoners overcome with fear, urinating themselves with terror. I've seen men so angry and bitter that they use every last breath in their lungs, calling down curses on their enemies. And I've seen proud men determined to die brave, putting on that stoic face to the very end. But I have never in my life seen anyone die the way this Jesus died. He wouldn't drink the sour wine. He didn't have much to say even before we drove the iron spikes through his wrists and the space above his ankles into the solid wood underneath. He didn't try and hide the pain the way some prisoners do, but he didn't cry out either. He just bore it. And he seemed sad, but in a thoughtful way. He was determined, and yet there was a sense of peace. And I swear, when he looked at me, as I stood over him just before that cross was lifted up, he looked me right in the eyes, and it seemed like compassion for me in his eyes. It made no sense. Around noon, the sun went behind the clouds. At least that's what everybody said happened. I don't remember seeing the clouds roll in, and it got really dark, really fast. Between you and me, clouds didn't explain that kind of darkness. It was unnatural. Now, I typically would shrug that kind of thing off, but this Jesus of Nazareth was in my head now. I stood under that cross and listened. He didn't speak much, but what he did have to say just baffled me. At one point, I'm almost sure I heard him ask his God to forgive me and the other people that were torturing him to death. At one point, he cried out, and those in the crowd said that he was trying to call some Jewish prophet to come and rescue him, but it didn't sound like that to me. It almost sounded like a line from a song, at least what a song might sound like coming through the parched lips of a dying man. As I stood there in the darkness, thinking about what I was witnessing, I began to question myself. Who was this man? What was it they'd said about him? Not the Messiah part, not the king part. They'd said he was the Son of God. That he was divine. I always assumed that was a political fiction to prop up Jewish rebellion, just like we do with the emperor. But what if there was more to it than that? It seemed ridiculous. And yet, I'd never seen a man die this way before. And then, around 3 p.m., I watched him die. No, die isn't the right word. He didn't expire. He wasn't overcome by exhaustion. His life didn't drain away. He surrendered it. He gave it up. I know that sounds crazy. But I have seen men overcome with exhaustion, suffocated by the weight of their own bodies on the cross. I know what it looks like. I know what it sounds like. And this was not that. He had air in his lungs. He cried out in a loud voice, and then he was gone. His lifeless body hung there. And I stood in awe. And just as I was beginning to process what I'd witnessed, I felt the ground shake beneath me. And I wasn't the only one. Nobody talked about it, but I could see in their eyes, those other men, they felt it too. And that's when I knew. That's when I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt we had done something terrible. We had killed an innocent man. Or was he a man? No, he was a man. He bled like a man. He died like a man. He felt pain like a man, but he died like no man ever could. He was a man, but he was more than just a man. I was sure of it. And as the ground stilled beneath my feet and my heart beat louder and harder than it ever beat before in my life, I could not contain my words, and I let out an audible cry. Surely this was an innocent man. Certainly this was the Son of God. My men looked at me. They didn't argue, but I didn't say anything else. What could I say? It was done. It was over. He was dead. And I was terrified, and yet, in the midst of that terror, I was overcome with a sense of awe and joy even that I was standing there breathing. That this God would allow me to continue to exist after this unspeakable act of violence that I just committed against his Son. It was like no other God I'd ever heard of. And I thought in that moment that this is a God that maybe I could learn to serve. This is a God that maybe I could even learn to love. But there was nothing more to be done. Jesus was dead. We took his body off the cross before the sunset that ushered in the Sabbath, and we delivered it to Governor Pilate. He was surprised at how quickly Jesus had died. And he'd already been contacted by some wealthy friends of Jesus who'd found a grave for him. I know some guys that actually been assigned to guard duty on that grave. Apparently the priests are worried somebody's going to try and steal the body. That's not what I'd be worried about, though. See, this Jesus may be dead, but there is a God up there in heaven who can shake the earth and darken the sun, and he is still there, and he is not done with us. This death can't be the end. There's got to be something else. I told you I'm not a superstitious man, but I've always felt that way about death. I've seen so much of it. Not just up there on the cross, in battle and in life. Death from old age, death from disease, death from accidents, death that doesn't make any sense, and it doesn't matter when it happens or who it happens to. It never seems like that should be the end. It always seems incomplete. And yet every time I think that, I know I'm being silly and superstitious because we all know that dead people stay dead. Death is the end. That's it. Of course, that's what they would have said about Lazarus. Lazarus was dead. That's what he says. And he's alive now. What if death isn't the end? What if there's something else after death? It sounds ridiculous. And yesterday I would have laughed at the idea, but I witnessed a death this afternoon that doesn't make any sense if death is the end. I witnessed a death that has to mean something more. I don't know how it ends. I don't know what's to become of me, the man who tortured God's Son to death. but there has to be more to the story.